On May 8, 1587, approximately 120 settlers left England and sailed to Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina, arriving sometime in July 1587. The governor of the new 1587 Roanoke settlement was John White, an explorer and artist. There were a few small attacks from local Native Americans within the first month, and the colonists reportedly desperately wanted John White to return to England and retrieve more supplies for them, such as food, tools, and more people. So on August 25th, 1587, just a month after arriving, White sailed back to England to gather supplies, leaving behind 115 colonists, 87 men, 17 women, and 11 children, including his own daughter, Eleanor White Dare, who had just given birth to a daughter, and White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first baby born in North America to English parents. Unfortunately, White's timing was poor. England was on the verge of going to war with Spain, which had a particularly strong armada, and he was unable to return to Roanoke for some time. It was not until August of 1590, 3 years later, that White would finally make his way back to the island. To his bewilderment, when White arrived, he found that the entire colony had vanished without a trace. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved into a fence post and crow carved into a tree. White then reportedly made 2 attempts to sail south about 50 miles to the nearby Croatoan island, now known as Hatteras Island, to search for the colonists. However, according to White, both trips were foiled by storms, and he was forced to turn back each time. Because the boat White was using was privately owned, he was unable to try looking for a third time. He returned to Europe and moved to Ireland, where he passed away in 1593, never knowing what became of his family. To this day, nobody knows for certain the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke. Even more chilling, despite 115 people disappearing, no bodies or signs of a mass grave have ever been found. Historians have theorized on the lost colony in the hundreds of years that have passed, and plenty of people online have pointed to supernatural causes. None have been able to provide conclusive evidence. That being said, let's jump into the theories. The first theory is that the settlers were murdered by a local Native American tribe. In fact, a previous attempt had been made by the English to colonize Roanoke Island years before, between 1585 and 1586, but they soon returned to England after attacks from some of the Native Americans they encountered, as well as a shortage of food. The governor of the first Roanoke colony, Ralph Lane, was not known for his diplomacy with the Native Americans. Lane would actually go on to kill the king of the local tribe, Wengina, in an attempt to prevent the natives from rising up against the colonists. This prompted Sir Francis Drake to come rescue the colonists and bring them back to England. As you know, a different set of English colonists would return about a year later, in 1587, and vanish. Though, as mentioned before, no mass graves or any large-scale number of bodies have ever been found that might support the idea that over 100 people had been murdered. The second theory is that the English settlers joined a nearby friendly Native American tribe and assimilated. One possible Native American ambassador was a man named Manteo, who traveled to England in 1584, but also made a second year-long trip after that between the two Roanoke expeditions. In fact, he sailed back to Roanoke with John White and the new colonists in 1587, spending months together on the journey across the Atlantic. Furthermore, after Manteo was baptized upon his return to Roanoke, John White declared Manteo to be the chief of the Roanoke and Croatoan tribes, whom the English called the Croatan. However, Manteo was only from the Croatan tribe, not the Roanoke tribe. He could not control them, and so he ended up going back to Croatoan Island with his people, possibly returning at some point to Roanoke to take the colonists with him to Croatoan Island. In 1888, 54 Croatan Native Americans petitioned Congress for aid, describing themselves as a remnant of White's lost colony. A few months later, the directors of the Ethnological Bureau responded writing, quote, It was thought that traces of white blood could be discovered among the Indians, some among they having gray eyes. It is probable that the greater number of the colonists were killed, but it was quite in keeping with Indian usages that a greater or less number, especially women and children, should have been made captive and subsequently incorporated into the tribe, end quote. In 2015, archaeologists found a series of objects of European origin on Hatteras Island, where the Croatan tribe resided. This included broken bowls from England, the hilt of an iron rapier sword, and a writing tablet made of slate that may have still had the letter M printed on it, and aglets. The sword is of a type used in England in the 16th century, and the hilt of it would have belonged to an Englishman of high standing. The writing tablet would have been used by educated upper-class Europeans. Aglets are small copper tubes used before the 17th century to secure wool fibers. Therefore, these findings would seem to point to the presence of colonists of roughly the same time period and class as the people of Roanoke. However, most of the European finds on Hatteras Island were among other objects that date back to the 17th century, about 100 years after the disappearance of the Roanoke colony. Last but not least, this theory could explain the carving Croatoan that the settlers left behind, perhaps as a clue to their whereabouts. Which brings us to our third theory, that the lost colonists didn't move to Croatoan, but instead moved inland. If you'll recall, John White, the governor of Roanoke, was also an artist. He was also part of the original failed Roanoke expedition, and between 1585 and 1593, he created a detailed watercolor map titled, quote, La Virginie Parse, end quote, that shows the North Carolina coast and includes both Roanoke and Croatoan Island, which are colored red. The cartography of the map is thought to be extremely accurate, described by museum experts as, quote, the most careful, detailed piece of cartography for any part of North America to be made in the 16th century, end quote. And when compared to modern satellite imagery of the same area, the only differences in the map are the naturally changing shapes of the coastline. At a glance, this seemed like nothing more than a map, but upon closer inspection, this map was revealed to perhaps hide secrets that seemed straight out of the film National Treasure. In 2012, a non-profit organization called the First Colony Foundation requested that the British Museum re-examine two small patches on the map. Using patches to cover mistakes or damage was a common technique in 16th century map making, because maps took so much time and work to create that starting over wasn't a viable option. Using X-ray spectroscopy, infrared light, and other imaging techniques, the British Museum was able to determine that the smaller patch was covering a four-pointed star, outlined in blue and filled in with red. According to the British Museum's report, quote, while the detailed interpretation of this symbol is beyond the scope of the study and is best left to experts in the field, it seems certain to represent a fort or fortification, end quote. In other words, the star may show the location of a fort inland from Roanoke Island on the western side of Albemarle Sound, where the colonists could have resettled. Further adding to the mystery, when examined closely, it was discovered that there are actually light markings of this possible fort on top of the patch as well. The British Museum's report posits the markings faded over time, but it also proposes, quote, one other possible, if rather romantic explanation is that these lines could reflect the use of an invisible ink, an ink that would only be revealed when treated in some way, usually by applying heat, end quote. As demonstrated in the film National Treasure, these invisible markings could be accomplished by using milk or lemon juice. If this fort was indeed intended to be hidden, why the secrecy? Some speculate White could have wanted to hide the colony's location from the English court, which may have contained spies. Whatever the marks indicate, they believe this evidence supports the idea that the settlers could have left Roanoke Island for this inland location. Interestingly, John White himself reportedly made an oblique reference to a location 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island in his account of what happened when he returned. Excavations on this site have turned up evidence of Europeans, including Surrey Hampshire borderware, a type of ceramics that was discontinued soon after Jamestown in 1624, and aglets, the aforementioned copper tube used before the early 17th century to secure wool fibers. This is the best indication of tying the location to Roanoke colonists, though these items cannot, without a doubt, be dated to the same exact time frame. Even if it's eventually confirmed that the colonists moved inland or to Croatoan Island, many possible unanswerable questions remain, such as why did they leave Roanoke Island, and what happened to them afterward, since no definitive existence of any of the 115 lost colonists was documented after August 25th, 1587. These questions have led some to point to supernatural causes. In the end, the mystery of Roanoke continues to baffle. Did they simply relocate, perhaps joining a neighboring tribe? Were they killed due to tensions with the locals? Or does the answer lie beyond our comprehension? The true fate of the legendary lost colony of Roanoke remains unsolved.